In the latest on that conflict in the Central African Republic, authorities say as many as 100 people may have been killed in clashes in Bria earlier this week. Fighting broke out between Christian anti-Balaka militia and former Seleka members. It came just hours after 13 of the country's 14 armed groups signed a peace deal with the government to halt all violence.
The aftermath of the violence that's rocked the Central African Republic town of Bria. Authorities say the death toll could be as high as 100. Bria is around 600 kilometers northeast of the capital Bangui. Fighting between armed groups broke out just the day after a peace accord was signed in Rome. Brokered by the Catholic Sant Egidio group, the truce called for an immediate ceasefire, and many had hoped it would bring lasting peace.
Ce qu'il faut dire, c'est que non seulement les groupes armés sont allés à Saint-Egidio de bon gré.
I really believe that not only are the people of the Central African Republic tired, but I also think that the armed groups have realized that the violence will not help them achieve their objectives.
Une nouvelle donne, une volonté d'aller.
Monday's accord is the latest in a string of unsuccessful peace deals.
After
the various peace agreements, there were renewed attacks on the ground. So the question everyone is asking is, are the armed groups that took part in the latest signing doing it out of good faith, or is it just a formality to make people forget what's happening? Or are they doing it to help the country find peace? We don't know.
Locals are tired of the seemingly never-ending violence.
What's disappointing is that when you sign a ceasefire agreement, then there are new attacks on the ground. The government should have deployed the army to prevent these attacks. There was a peace deal, but the Central African Army was not here. So I don't understand why we are talking about ceasefire.
It's not the first time. There has been ceasefire after ceasefire. If they agree to sign a peace accord, then they should respect that agreement.
About 440,000 people had been displaced throughout the country by the end of April. The UN has warned that the number could reach 500,000 by the end of June. Jane Keo, CGTN.
To help us understand more about the situation in the Central African Republic, I'm joined in studio by Richard Moncrieff, the Central Africa Director for the International Crisis Group. Thank you for joining us.
Hello.
Is it so strange that so many people are killed in the Central African Republic so soon after a peace deal was signed? What could have gone wrong?
Well, I'm afraid it's no surprise because we've had peace deals like this in the past. And despite the fairly generous terms of this deal, which offers the armed groups political recognition, offers them places in the army, and it's already been criticised by human rights groups in Bangui for doing so, it hasn't stopped the armed groups. Well, why not? Because the situation on the ground remains the same, broadly speaking. The armed groups, whether they're fighting for revenge, whether they're fighting to protect their communities, or whether they're pillaging resources, they'll continue to do so until some real changes can be made on the ground.
But why is it proving so difficult to find a political solution to the crisis in the C.A.R.?
The crux of it is the balance of power. The problem is that the armed groups, which are well armed, they're spread out across very wide areas of the country. They control really the whole central belt of the country. It's the balance of power. Remember that the UN forces, 13,000 troops, and already we've heard only in the last couple of days that they're having trouble in maintaining the number of troops. They can't get troop contributing countries to send their troops to the country. They are very, very overstretched. They've got to have a significant force in the capital, Bangui, to protect that. Beyond that, they're able to protect one town, maybe two, and they have done in the past. But when the trouble stretches out across the centre of the country to 2, 3, 4 towns, as it has done this month and in May, they're really overstretched. They're also being attacked by armed groups. This is something of a new phenomenon, a very worrying one. That puts them back on the defensive and they're less able to protect civilians. Some elements of the force are doing a good job. They're trying to protect civilians. Others are a bit more passive. So we really need to see a force that's active, gets out protecting civilians, strikes back at the armed groups that are causing so much pain for the country, and are more mobile as well. That's a very big and important
So
factor.
what can the international community do to help this country stabilize and finding a lasting solution?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned force, and I think that the role of the UN is critical, partly because the army of the Central African Republic is a long way from being operational. They're still in training mode. They're not deployed at all outside Bangui. The police force also is completely absent from these areas. So at the moment, people's security is reliant on the UN, and we've got to have a really substantial mobile deterrent force in the UN, in the form of the UN, and that's very important. Second thing, I think we need better diplomacy, and I'm afraid that some of the elements of the recent Rome Agreement don't go in the right direction. We need better pressure on the armed groups, and that means getting countries that may have some influence, like neighbouring Chad, for example, to exert as much influence as they can to get them to lay down their weapons. And a third point, if I may, that we need to look also back at the root causes of this and how these armed groups are funding themselves. Two elements stand out. They're funding themselves on minerals, and they tend to occupy mining sites, and they're also attacking pastoralists, attacking people who take cattle across the country. If we can find ways of loosening their grip on those key elements, then we could start to see some more substantial and sustainable progress.
And that sort of just preempts, what I was asking myself. I was wondering, because these are 13 of the 14 armed groups that have signed or committed themselves to this peace deal, and that's representative enough of these militia groups in the country, isn't it? So where really is the problem? Where won't they commit to it?
Well, there was a member of an armed group quoted by the media yesterday, and he said, there might be an agreement signed in Rome, but I've still got to defend my community. Now, I think that says a lot, because although there's a signed agreement, what's happening in a given town, a given village, again, whether it's protecting a community or whether it's much more nefarious motivations like pillaging, they still pertain. So the people who go and sign the agreement, they might tell their commanders on the ground, I've signed this agreement. Doesn't have any impact, because it's the balance of power on the ground that really counts.
And the root causes, like you mentioned.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you so much, Richard, for those great insights. Thank you. We had here in studio Richard Moncrieff of the Central Africa Director, International Crisis Group.